When most Christians think about the book of Romans, they probably think of justification by faith alone, or God's sovereignty in election, or Paul's magisterial description of sin and grace. What they probably don't think about is Spain. But what if those two things, the deepest theology in the New Testament and a missionary road trip to the western edge of the ancient world, are actually inseparable? What if Romans is, at its very core, a missionary document? I'm your host, Jared Luttjeboer, and welcome to MarsCast, the podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary. Today, we're kicking off a three-part conversation drawn from a fascinating article by Dr. Marcus Mininger, published in Mid-America's Journal of Theology, titled The Epistle to the Romans, Profound Theology for the Sake of Missions. In this first episode, we're looking at how Paul frames the entire letter to the Romans and why understanding that frame changes the way we read everything in between. It's easy to pick up Romans and dive straight into the doctrinal content. We can think of justification, election, the law, for example. That's what it's famous for, and that's mostly how it gets used. But Dr. Mininger, you make a provocative claim at the outset of your article that reading Romans this way, as a kind of free-floating theological treatise, actually misses something the letter itself is very explicit about. So before we get into what Romans says, we do need to ask a more basic question, and that is, why does it exist at all? So what does the way most people read Romans tend to overlook about the book as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been a really important question to the history of scholarship in the last probably 50 years, ever since the work of Paul Mininger on the obedience of faith concept in the 70s, but really has come to particular, I think, helpful expression in the commentary, recent major commentary on Romans by Robert Jewett in the Hermeneia series. This question of, as one author put it, what makes Romans tick? What makes it kind of go? And why does it have what it has in it? And what explains all of this very rich and diverse content? I think what most people historically have been overlooking about Romans is that it's actually a letter, that it's truly a communication from Paul to the Christians in Rome at a particular time and place, with set purposes that help guide Paul in what to say, what not to say, how to say it, and so forth. So, traditionally, Romans, as you mentioned, Jared, the history of interpretation traditionally has focused a lot on justification by faith, which really means, even if you just do kind of a basic search in Romans for where that language and topic shows up, means it especially has to do with Romans 1 through 5. That would be the heart of where a lot of scholarship centers, especially given that the history of Roman scholarship so influenced by Luther and Lutherans. It's hugely important, but also it does have a somewhat limited profile in the letter as a whole. So more recently, other interpreters in the mid-20th century and beyond began to focus instead on, say, Jew-Gentile relationships and the question of Israel and things like that. So then other parts of Romans especially come to the fore, chapter 4, maybe in particular with Abraham, various things, but chapter 4 would be a center, chapters 9 through 11 especially, right? Kind of the rehabilitation. Older commentaries used to talk directly about 9 through 11 as a digression or an excursus, as if it's really unrelated to the actual subject matter of Romans. And then recent scholarship has said, no, this is very important to the letter. In fact, centrally important. And of course, it is very, very important. But both of those approaches, the traditional one and the more recent socially oriented one, which is partly, generated by, say, the new perspective on Paul, but others as well. Both of those approaches share something in common, is that they're not really able to integrate the whole letter in their reading, so that all of the sections of it are well understood for why they're there and what they contribute to the whole, right? So one of the interesting features of Romans itself is that it has the longest introduction and the longest conclusion sections of any of Paul's letters by far. So the letter specific components like description of author, description of audience being written to, greeting and prayer and thanksgiving and travel plans and those kinds of things at the beginning, and then at the end an entire chapter almost of greetings to people in Rome, and as well as other descriptions of Paul's plans. So it's very important, and again, scholarship has increasingly noticed and sought to make appropriate give an appropriate place to these features of the letter. But there's more to it than that. It's not just, hey, this is a long introduction and a long conclusion, which could still be kind of a formality. It's beyond that is when you read the introductory sections in Romans 1 through 16, especially, and then the concluding sections, most of chapter 15 and 16 at the end, what you can observe and what we need to observe is this massive set of parallels between them, where things that Paul mentions in 1 through 16, he only mentions again in many instances. The only other place where it's mentioned again is in the second half of chapter 15 or into chapter 16. So if we focus on 1 through 16 and 15 verses 14 through 33, so chapter 15 from verse 14 on, we can see a lot of it. Let me mention this to you because it's actually fairly intricate, and so I'll try to explain it. But obviously, you can get out your Bibles and see for yourself if you read those things back to back. There are at least 9 strong verbal and thematic parallels, many of which only occur in those sections of the letter. So firstly, the one that comes up first would be Paul's somewhat unusual, very unusual actually, mention of the purpose of his apostleship being separated unto the gospel of God. To describe it there, it's not stated as the gospel of Jesus Christ or the gospel about various other things related to Christ. Here it's stated as the gospel of God. That phrase only occurs then later in 15:16. That would be a first example. Secondly, Paul gives some time to describing the distinct grace that God has imparted to him and its purpose as being in order to bring about the obedience or the service of Gentile peoples unto God. So this is stated in chapter 1:5, where he says that he was given grace and apostleship in order to bring about the obedience of faith among the Gentiles. And then he comes back to that language in chapter 15, verses 15 to 16. Thirdly, and I'll just list these. Really, it's the aggregate effect of them that we want to talk about, but noticing that they're there helps give weight to it. The third thing is, I guess I already mentioned it, but it's his apostleship is unto the Gentiles, and the specific goal of his apostleship is to bring about their obedience. So that language of obedience of faith, or an obedience that comes from faith, that occurs in chapter 1:5. And then it occurs, something similar occurs in 15:18. Then if you look at the very, very end of the letter, 16:26, that same exact phrase again appears again. This is one of the phrases that really started percolating this discussion about Romans as a letter. But it's unique language. Paul doesn't use it in any other documents, but he frames the whole epistle to Romans around this concept of reaching the Gentiles for the obedience of faith. Fourthly, he comments directly on the strength of the Roman churches, what good that is going on in their lives in chapter 1:8, and then again in 15:14. He talks both times about how he wants to visit Rome in 1:11 and 15:23. And then he articulates some of his reasons for having been absent from Rome as kind of a thing that needs to be explained. Why have I never come to visit you before? He talks about that in 1:13 and in 15:22, and he's sort of giving some defense of himself in that. There's a we'll come back to this later, but there's a need that Paul shows to explain some things to Rome to clear up some misperceptions. Seventh, he articulates his desire to give something to the Romans and then also to receive something from them in return. This back and forth of mutual giving. He talks about both of those in chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. And then in chapter 15, it occurs several times. Chapter 15, verse 15, verse 23, 28, and 32, which then leads to his desire, which he articulates more clearly in chapter 15. What does that really mean? In chapter 15, he kind of lays his cards fully on the table and says that he's hoping to receive financial help from them. So he wants to impart to them a spiritual blessing through his teaching, and he also wants then to be able to receive financial help from them for his larger ministry. Eighth, he talks about his hope of the focus of his ministry having to do with the hope of salvation for both Jews and Gentiles, and his concern to defend the appropriateness of that as not impugning God himself, God's fairness, God's justice, God's consistency, God's righteousness, but actually fitting with all of those in giving salvation to Jews and Gentiles both equally. And then ninth, his commitment to minister to all kinds of people. So like in chapter 1, verse 14, he talks about both the wise, so both Greeks and barbarians, wise and foolish. This mention of barbarians in chapter 1:14 is unusual language in our ears, but it has to do with the more uncultured people groups of the Roman Empire as the Romans would view it. And in chapter 15, Paul comes directly back to saying he wants to reach Spain. Spain would have been a classic example of who the Romans would consider barbarians. And Paul mentions then, so his desire to reach the barbarians in 1:14, his specific desire to reach the Spanish in 15:24 and 28. And so all told, there's this massive, what we call an inclusio. It's like a bracketing function where an author mentions specific things at the beginning of a section of text and at the end of that same section of text, in part that kind of shows that it is a coherent section of text. So we have to start by saying, look, Paul's done a very noticeable thing here. If you read the whole letter, he has begun in the end of the letter with very lengthy sections articulating some specific themes that only appear in those sections. And so obviously the whole thing is stylized. The whole thing is designed very carefully. And then we need to ask the question, what does that mean?
Yeah, thanks for pointing out that inclusio there. I think that's very important. And, for scholars, that just might sound like a footnote, but you argue that it's really key to unlocking how Paul intends the whole letter to be read. So if this massive inclusio connects Romans 1 and 15, what does this tell us about how to read Romans?
Yeah, so we've kind of just gone through and said, hey, all these parallels exist between these two sections, right? Chapter 1 through 16, and then chapter 15, especially 14 through 33. But what of it? Why does it matter? I said, so far, just it shows that Paul has a design purpose for the whole letter. It helps show that the beginning and end aren't just mere formalities and trappings. They're closely and cleverly designed. But it's actually a lot more than that as well. When you have an inclusio in Greek, in ancient Greek writings, the content of the inclusio, the content of the themes mentioned at the beginning and end of a section are signals for the fact that topic mentioned in the inclusio is a key organizing topic for everything that comes in between, right? So that it's sort of like giving a heading in modern ways of constructing text. Remember that ancient texts don't have headings, they don't have tables of contents, they don't have section markings and so forth. They don't even have bold and italics and like all kinds of things we're used to that show importance, emphasis. So in an ancient text, one of the ways to do that is this inclusio. So what it means essentially is all of the content in between the introduction to the epistle 1 through 16, and then 15, 14 through 33, all of the content in between should be read in light of these themes mentioned only in the bracketing areas, right? At the beginning and the end. Or to put it, so we have to then say, what is the focus of the 9 things I just mentioned? And how does that help shape our reading of the letter, right? You think it to yourself about, and this is what you led with, of course, in your intro, but if you were to go through Romans in your head and think, what are the notable sections, the memorable sections, the sections it's well known for, right? You could go through a whole litany that goes right through the letter, from like the description of natural revelation and God's wrath and homosexual sins in chapter 1. You could think about the doctrine of total depravity, and the inability of the law in chapter 3, justification by faith, the key justification texts also in 4 and 5, of course, the Adam Christ theology of chapter 5, the debates about the law in chapter 7, antinomianism, chapter 6, the Spirit, assurance, future eschatology in Romans 8. Just keep going, right? Israel in 9 through 11, sections about the civil magistrate in 13, sections about adiaphora and foods that do or don't are or aren't permissible to eat. Those are the things that Romans is known for. But what Paul's talking about in the framing of the letter, this massive inclusio, is Spain, mission to Spain, and how he wants the Romans to support him in a mission to Spain. Now, as we think about that, we need to remember that ancient letters, when they were sent, were meant to mediate the presence of the person to the audience in that person's absence, right? So the purpose of the letter is going to be related to Paul's stated purpose of what he wants to accomplish once he's with them. Well, what does he want to accomplish once he's with them? He wants to give them a spiritual gift, which of course would mean teaching, and he wants to receive then mutual encouragement, he says, and support, financial support. All of that should tell us that this is also what he's beginning to make the way for by the letter to the Romans. In other words, Romans is written in order to pave the way for the church in Rome supporting a mission to barbarian, Spanish, unreached people groups that Paul has a desire and intent to proclaim the gospel to. The whole purpose of the letter then is to pave the way in Paul's relationship to the people in Rome so that they together will desire and be well equipped to send him on a mission to Spain. So while Romans isn't mostly about missions and what it's talking about, it is all for the sake of missions from the beginning to the end.
Today we've established something that I think reorients how we read one of the most important books in the Bible. Romans is not a free-floating theological treatise. It's a letter written to a specific church by a specific apostle with a specific and urgent missionary goal, and that is to enlist the Roman Christians as partners in taking the gospel to an unreached corner of the ancient world. But Paul didn't just write Romans to ask for money. He had to overcome 3 significant obstacles standing between him and a unified Roman church that could effectively support a mission to Spain. Now, these obstacles drove him to write the most theologically comprehensive letter in the New Testament. Join us for part 2 about how Paul's theology was precisely calibrated to solve real missionary problems. Until then, this is Marscast from Mid-America Reformed Seminary. I'm Jared Luttjeboer. I'll catch you next time.